You couldn't survive without me. My wife said it while standing in our kitchen. I remember the exact way she said it. Not angry, not emotional, certain, like she was stating a fact. I looked at her and simply said, "Okay." 6 months later, she was sitting across from me asking how I managed to move on so easily. The truth, I didn't move on easily. I just stopped letting someone convince me I was weaker than I really was. My name is Ryan. I'm 37 years old. At the time all this happened, I'd been married to my wife, Lauren, for almost 8 years. When we first met, she was one of the most supportive people I'd ever known. Confident, driven, funny. She pushed me to take risks, encouraged me to start my own business, believed in me when most people didn't. That's one of the reasons what happened later took me so long to recognize. Because people don't usually become different overnight. Sometimes they change so slowly that you don't notice until years have passed. When Lauren and I got married, I was working as an operations manager. Good job, good income, predictable future. 3 years into our marriage, I started my own consulting business. The first year was rough. The second year was better. By the third year, things were finally becoming stable. But during those difficult years, something shifted inside Lauren. At first, it was subtle. Small comments, little jokes, nothing serious. At least that's what I told myself. Whenever a bill arrived unexpectedly, she'd say, "Good thing one of us has a real paycheck." Then she'd laugh. Whenever business was slow, she'd say, "Maybe entrepreneurship isn't for everyone." Then she'd smile. The comments weren't aggressive. They were dismissive. Just enough to sting. Not enough to start a fight. And because they were small, I ignored them. Looking back now, that was mistake number one. The second mistake was assuming she was joking. Because eventually, the jokes stopped sounding like jokes. One evening, we were having dinner with friends. The conversation turned toward careers. Someone asked how business was going. Before I could answer, Lauren smiled and said, "We're all hoping Ryan figures it out eventually." Everyone laughed, including me. What else was I supposed to do? Correct her in front of everyone? Make things awkward? So I smiled, changed the subject, and pretended it didn't bother me. But it did. A lot. A few months later, another red flag appeared. Lauren started making decisions without discussing them. Nothing huge at first. Purchases, weekend plans, family commitments, small things, then larger things. One afternoon, I discovered she'd committed us to helping her sister move across the state. An entire weekend. Without asking me. When I mentioned it, she rolled her eyes. "You'll manage." That phrase became another favorite. You'll manage. You'll figure it out. Stop being dramatic. Every concern I raised somehow became evidence that I was difficult. Not because my concerns were unreasonable, because they were inconvenient. Then came her friend, Melissa. Every story like this seems to have one person who constantly makes things worse. For us, it was Melissa. Melissa had been divorced twice. She treated relationships like competitions. Everything was about control, power, leverage, winning. And Lauren spent more and more time with her. The more time they spent together, the more Lauren changed. At least that's how it felt. Melissa constantly reinforced one idea. Women shouldn't need men. Which wasn't the problem. The problem was what she actually meant. She didn't mean independence. She meant superiority. And eventually, Lauren started talking the same way. One night after dinner, she casually said, "I honestly don't know how you'd function without me." I laughed, because I thought she was teasing. She wasn't. "I mean it." "What do you mean?" She shrugged. I handle everything. That wasn't true. Not even close. But arguing felt pointless. So once again, I let it go. Then came another incident. One that should have opened my eyes much sooner. Lauren's parents hosted a family barbecue. About 20 people attended. At some point, the conversation turned toward marriage. Lauren's brother joked about being scared of his wife. Everyone laughed. Then Lauren looked directly at me and said, "Ryan couldn't survive a month without me." The table laughed. Her mother laughed. Melissa laughed. Lauren laughed. I forced a smile. Inside, I felt something very different. Humiliation. Because this wasn't a joke anymore. This was becoming part of her identity. The capable wife. The helpless husband. The problem was that none of it was true. I paid the bills, managed our finances, ran a company, handled most home maintenance, did my share of everything. But reality didn't seem important anymore. The narrative mattered more. And the narrative was simple. Lauren was the reason our life worked. I was just lucky to have her. The final warning sign came 2 weeks later. I landed one of the biggest contracts in my company's history. A huge opportunity. Something I'd worked toward for years. I came home excited, proud, ready to celebrate. Lauren listened for about 30 seconds, then immediately started talking about her promotion. At first I thought she'd misunderstood. But no, she simply wasn't interested. The entire conversation somehow became about her. Later that night, I sat alone in my office thinking about it. For the first time, a difficult realization crossed my mind. Lauren didn't see us as a team anymore. She saw us as competitors. And in her mind, she was winning. The moment everything changed happened the following weekend. We were arguing about something small. Honestly, I don't even remember what started it. What I remember is how it ended. Lauren crossed her arms, looked directly at me, and said, "Let's be honest, Ryan. You couldn't survive without me." Then she added the sentence that stayed with me for months. "If you don't like it, prove me wrong." I stared at her. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I quietly nodded. Because, for the first time, I was starting to think maybe I should. After Lauren told me to prove her wrong, something shifted inside me. Not immediately. Not dramatically. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't threaten divorce. I didn't sleep on the couch. I simply stopped arguing. For years, I'd been trying to convince her that we were partners. Suddenly, I wasn't interested in having that conversation anymore. At first, she didn't notice. Why would she? People rarely notice when someone begins pulling away emotionally, especially when they're used to being the center of every discussion. The following week, I focused on work. The new contract required a lot of attention. Long hours, client meetings, hiring additional staff. For the first time in months, my energy wasn't being wasted defending myself at home. And something interesting happened. Business improved even faster. Meanwhile, Lauren continued acting exactly the same. The comments didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent. One evening, I came home after a 12-hour day. The moment I walked through the door, she pointed toward a stack of boxes in the garage. "You still haven't organized those." I looked at her. "I've been working all day." "So have I." Normally, that would have turned into an argument. This time, I simply nodded. "Okay." Her eyebrows lifted. That wasn't the response she expected. The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. Every criticism, every sarcastic comment, every passive-aggressive remark. I stopped reacting, not because I agreed, because I was tired. And the less I reacted, the more obvious her behavior became. Even to me. especially to me. One Friday evening, we attended dinner with Melissa and a few mutual friends. Halfway through the meal, someone asked about my business. Before I could answer, Lauren jumped in. Ryan thinks he's building an empire. The table laughed. Melissa laughed the hardest. Then Lauren added, "It's cute, honestly. Cute. 8 years of work. 6 employees. Hundreds of clients. Thousands of hours. Cute." For a moment, I just sat there, listening, watching, and suddenly I saw the situation differently. A year earlier, that comment would have hurt. Now it just looked sad, because she genuinely believed she was being reasonable. That was the scary part. She didn't see the disrespect anymore. She saw it as normal. On the drive home, she noticed I was quiet. "You've barely spoken all night." "I know. Are you upset?" "No." That answer bothered her more than if I'd admitted I was angry. Because anger meant engagement. Silence meant distance. And she was starting to feel it. A few days later, another issue surfaced. Lauren wanted to refinance the house. Not because we needed to. Because she wanted a larger budget for renovations. I wasn't opposed to improvements. I was opposed to unnecessary debt. When I explained that, she immediately rolled her eyes. "See, this is why I handle financial decisions." I looked at her. Handle. Someone has to. The statement was ridiculous. I managed every investment account we owned. Handled taxes. Built our savings plan. Tracked every major expense. Lauren knew that. Facts weren't the issue. Narrative was. And in her narrative, she was the responsible one. I was the burden. The conversation ended the way they all did, with her dismissing my concerns, and me walking away. Then came the discovery. The moment I realized the issue wasn't isolated incidents. It was a pattern, a serious one. A few weeks later, I was organizing paperwork for tax season. While reviewing our financial records, I noticed several large purchases. Designer bags, jewelry, weekend trips. Nothing illegal. Nothing secret. Just expensive. Far more expensive than I realized. When I asked about them, Lauren immediately became defensive. "Are you auditing me now?" "I'm asking a question. You never trust me." There it was. The same strategy. Deflect. Blame. Attack. Avoid. The actual issue disappeared immediately. The conversation became about my attitude. Not her spending. Not accountability. My attitude. That night, I sat in my office for nearly an hour. Thinking. Reviewing. Connecting dots. And that's when I finally understood something. The problem wasn't that Lauren believed she was better than me. The problem was that she needed to. Her confidence depended on it. Every joke. Every comparison. Every insult. Every dismissal. They all served the same purpose. Maintaining a story. A story where she was carrying me. A story where she was responsible for our success. A story where I couldn't function without her. The truth would have threatened that story. And people protect stories they depend on, even when those stories aren't real. The next month brought another major contract. The biggest in company history. By itself, it would have doubled annual revenue. I was excited. Not because of the money. Because of what it represented. Years of effort finally paying off. When I told Lauren, her reaction surprised me. Not because it was negative. Because it was indifferent. She barely looked up from her phone. "That's nice. That's nice." Nothing else. No excitement. No congratulations. No questions. Just 2 words. And somehow those 2 words hurt more than the insults. because they revealed something important. She wasn't rooting for me anymore. At some point, she had stopped wanting me to succeed. Success would contradict the version of me she'd spent years describing. A few nights later, everything finally came to a head. We were discussing finances again. Another argument. Another criticism. Another conversation where she treated me like an employee instead of a husband. Then she said something that changed everything. Something she couldn't take back. You'd be completely lost without me. I stayed quiet. She kept going. I handle everything important. Still quiet. Honestly, you should be grateful. That was the moment. Not because it was the worst thing she'd ever said. The second I said, okay, Lauren's confidence disappeared. Not completely. Just enough for me to notice. For years, every disagreement had followed the same script. She'd criticize me. I'd defend myself. She'd double down. I'd try to explain. Eventually, we'd both calm down. Nothing changed. This time, the script broke. And when the script broke, so did the illusion she had been living in. The next morning, Lauren acted like nothing had happened. She made coffee, answered emails, talked about weekend plans. Normal behavior. But every few minutes, she'd glance at me, like she was waiting for something. An apology, an explanation, a fight. Instead, I focused on work. When she asked what I wanted for dinner, I shrugged. When she asked if I was upset, I said, no. When she asked if we should talk, I said, not right now. The silence bothered her far more than any argument ever had. Because for the first time, she wasn't controlling the conversation. A week passed. Then another. I quietly met with an attorney. Not because I hated Lauren. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I needed clarity. I wanted to understand my options, my finances, my responsibilities, my future. The attorney asked a simple question. Do you want to save the marriage? I thought about it carefully, then answered honestly. I don't think I'm the only one who'd have to want that. That conversation stayed with me, because deep down I already knew the truth. You can't save a relationship by yourself, especially when the other person doesn't believe there's a problem. Meanwhile, Lauren was becoming increasingly frustrated. Not angry, confused. The dynamic she'd relied on for years wasn't working anymore. One evening, she walked into my office and asked, why are you acting so distant? I looked up from my laptop. I'm not. You clearly are. Maybe. She stared at me, waiting. I didn't continue. The silence stretched. Eventually, she left. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't chasing resolution. And that scared her. Then came the first consequence. Karma wave 1. I moved a significant portion of my work into a new office space I'd been considering for months. The decision had nothing to do with Lauren. At least initially. It was simply good for business. More room. More employees. More growth. But symbolically, it meant something else. Independence. Every step I took contradicted the story she'd been telling herself. The story where I couldn't function without her. Business continued growing. Revenue increased. Clients expanded. New opportunities appeared. And for the first time, Lauren could actually see it. Not hear about it. See it. One afternoon, she stopped by the office unexpectedly. She looked around. The staff, the conference room, the projects, the organized chaos of a growing company. And I could literally see the realization hitting her. This wasn't the picture she'd been carrying in her head. Not even close. That was the first clue. The first crack in the narrative. Then came the proof. A month later, one of our mutual friends hosted a gathering. Lauren and I both attended. For most of the evening, we stayed on opposite sides of the room. At one point, I ended up speaking with several people about work. Nothing unusual, just conversation. Afterward, one of the guests approached Lauren and said something I didn't hear. But I saw her reaction. Confusion, then discomfort. Later, I learned what happened. The guest had complimented my business, talked about its reputation, mentioned how impressed he was. Lauren didn't know how to respond, because she'd spent years telling people a very different story, and reality was beginning to challenge it. Then came the witness. The moment everything became impossible to ignore. A few weeks later, Lauren's sister called me. We'd always gotten along reasonably well. During the conversation, she said something unexpected. You know, Lauren talks about you like you're incapable. I stayed silent. She continued. But honestly, you've always been the stable one. That single sentence hit harder than I expected, because it confirmed something I'd slowly started realizing. Other people could see it too. Not everyone believed Lauren's version of events. Some had simply stayed quiet. The witness led to confirmation, and confirmation led to consequences. Karma wave 2 arrived quickly. The social fallout. Friends started asking questions. Family members started noticing inconsistencies. Not because I exposed Lauren. I never did. I never ran around telling people my side. I didn't need to. Reality was doing that work on its own. People observed. People connected dots. People formed conclusions. And many of those conclusions weren't flattering, especially for Lauren. One evening, she finally broke down. Not dramatically, not screaming, just exhausted. She sat across from me at the dining room table. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly asked, "Do you really think you don't need me?" The question surprised me, because for years she'd been making statements. Now she was asking questions. I thought carefully before answering, then said, "That's never been the point." She looked confused. "The point is, I never should have had to prove it." The room went silent, and for the first time, I think she truly understood. This wasn't about money, success, business, independence. It was about respect, or more accurately, the lack of it. Then came karma wave 3, the emotional consequence, the hardest one. Several weeks later, we officially separated. There was no dramatic betrayal, no explosive confrontation, no shocking secret, just years of accumulated disrespect finally reaching a limit. Lauren cried. I did too, because endings are painful even when they're necessary, especially when they're necessary. For months afterward, she continued reaching out. Not constantly, just enough. Small conversations, occasional check-ins, attempts to reconnect. The problem was that by then something fundamental had changed. I no longer needed her approval. And once that happened, the entire relationship looked different. Eventually, she admitted something I'd suspected for years. She never actually believed I was incapable. She believed I'd never leave. That's what gave her confidence. That's what allowed the jokes, the comparisons, the dismissiveness. She thought there would never be consequences. She was wrong. A year later, my life looked completely different. The company had grown substantially. I had a healthier routine, better friendships, less stress, more peace. Not because I became wildly successful, because I stopped spending energy trying to convince someone of my worth. That's the real upgrade. Not money, not status, self-respect. The funny thing is that Lauren was right about one thing. I did change after the marriage ended, but not in the way she expected. I didn't become harder, colder, more bitter. I became calmer, because once you stop carrying someone else's opinion of you, life gets surprisingly quiet. Looking back now, our marriage didn't end because of one sentence. It didn't end because she underestimated me.